Hey y'all, so I want to talk about hedonism. Those of y'all who don't know what hedonism is, it's essentially a philosophical belief that the end of human life is to experience the most pleasure possible, and that action should be taken in a way that maximizes pleasure and makes sure that pain is either avoidable or you avoid most of it while you can. I think that this is a mentality that a lot of people have when going about their lives, whether they have thought about this explicitly or maybe this is just how they choose to live their lives because, everyone wants to avoid pain and obviously pleasure is preferable to pain in most circumstances. Obviously, there can be certain arguments made about what that means in the context of hedonism, whether you always avoid short term pain or maybe you endure short term pain for the long term. But regardless, this is a philosophical attitude that I had for a good bulk of my life, and I want to talk about the reasons why I don't believe in that attitude anymore. I think it's really prevalent, especially among people who are at least my age in college, because I think that's generally the attitude that a lot of people apply. I mean, people want to go out to parties and drink as much as they can and have as much as fun as they can, and I don't mean to judge their lifestyle because there's certainly nothing. I don't want to say there's something wrong with that, but like you have your own liberty to choose the way you live. However, I do think that that is a mindset that a lot of people employ that I myself have found kind of troubling, especially when you look at it from an analytical perspective. The first thing I want to talk about that made me begin to doubt whether hedonism was a viable way that one should choose to live their life is the experience machine thought experiment. I learned about this in my first philosophy class that I took at UT, and essentially what it is that if you believe in hedonism, you believe that the end goal and the pure end goal of life is for you to maximize pleasure, and that is all that it is. There's nothing more, there's nothing less. You want to maximize pleasure. And that seemed like a pretty okay idea to me until I was told about this thought experiment. And essentially, what this does is that you go into an experience machine and you tell the doctor or whoever's administering this experience machine that for the next 70 years, you'll get to live the most ideal life possible within this machine. That will be it. You'll have the most pleasure possible. You'll be well respected. You'll be well liked. You'll have everything you could have wanted in life. And you'll have it all, but it'll only be in this experience machine. However, the experience machine, you can't tell the difference between it. So when you're experiencing these things, you actually believe that it's happening to you. And for the sake of argumentation, like you could say like, oh, there'll never be an experience machine that's able to fully replicate life. But again, this is a thought experiment, so don't take it too seriously. When looking at that, I realized that there is an intrinsic difference between actually experiencing those things and just experience it in an experience machine. And while that might seem intuitive to everyone, I believe that is a difference between those two, or most people would accept that there's a difference between those two, shows that it is not just purely pleasure that dictates what is valuable in life. Because if you have two experiences, like let's say you could live your real life exactly that way, or you could live the experience machine exactly that way, the hedonist would be forced to accept the fact that there is no intrinsic difference between the two. The reason being is that if you maximize pleasure to its fullest, it doesn't matter whether it's real or not, you only care about pleasure. That is something that I immediately realized I had a problem with. Obviously, I wouldn't want to live in an experience machine even though I could derive more pleasure from it. I mean, to a certain extent, you could say that living in the experience machine is preferable to living a life of abject poverty where you're hungry every day and you could barely get by. But I don't think that that is necessarily a good counterexample because it just shows that pleasure takes precedence at a certain point, but it doesn't make the argument that pleasure is the end all be all. And as a hedonist, you do subscribe to that stronger belief, and thus you're forced to accept certain unintuitive beliefs about that unless you decide to go back on that. But then if you go back on that, that's not really hedonism. Another way that my professor illustrated this that is a sort of twist on the experience machine thought experiment, and that's, let's say you live your life, just a normal life. You have a pretty good life, like you have a good job, your colleagues like you have a good spouse, you have kids that like you, just like the standard life that people generally think of. But it turns out that it's all an act. Your spouse hates you, your kids hate you, your colleagues make fun of you, they don't think you're competent. You've been given this job purely because they all know and they're all in on the fact that you're a fool, but you don't believe that. And you experience life and then you die, and then you have your whole life believing that all these good things happen to you. There's also the alternative of you living life where you actually do experience all those things. And again, when choosing between the two, you begin to realize that even though you derive the same pleasure from both of them, there is inherently something better about living the life where people actually do respect you, where people actually do love you, as opposed to making a fool of you without you knowing. Sure, the pleasure you derive from the two is the same, but it would be really hard for me, or for anyone for that matter, to say with a straight face that, yeah, those two are exactly the same, and I really wouldn't have a preference as to which one I would live. The other thing that made me be very skeptical of hedonism in terms of like a philosophical belief that one lives by is the fact that the end goal of hedonism is for you to be free. Because in a lot of other sort of philosophical mindsets that you can employ, you might not feel free. In fact, you might have to embrace pain or hardship at a certain time to fully subscribe to those ideas. And a lot of the people who subscribe to hedonism, I would imagine, feel like by living that way, they are free from the constraints of the world or other things that they might just want to break away from. And to a certain extent, I think that is why I chose to subscribe to hedonism earlier in my life, because I felt that by living for pleasure, I was able to relinquish myself from certain things that seemed stressful or seemed harmful that I just didn't want to deal with. And however that freedom doctrine goes to a certain extent, you could 100% make the argument that living in a hedonistic way, you aren't free in the sense that you will become a slave to your desires. Because living hedonistically, you just basically take the course of action that will drive you the most pleasure. However, I think we all know how it could feel when you choose to give into your desires every single time. And at least for me, like when I doom scroll on Instagram or on Reddit, like that doesn't feel good to me in the long run. It might feel good in the short term, and the only reason why I'm really doing it for the most part is to derive pleasure from it. Yet I do end up becoming a slave to the doom. I end up becoming a slave to the doom scrolling if I continue to live like that. And I think when you become so reliant on indulging in whatever you might consider to be hedonistic, some people might be drinking, some people might be eating a lot, playing like video games every day for like 30 hours. Okay, that's not mathing, but like 14 hours a day. I mean, sure, you could, like, to a certain extent, you're freeing yourself from those other stressors is making you a slave to the things that you believe is liberating you. And I think that we can all understand why this is problematic. I mean, I think the same thing can be said for people who are addicted to drugs. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of people who become addicted to drugs that 100% like the lifestyle they're living. A lot of it is because they might opt to stop if they could, but they just can't. They become a slave to drugs, and they become a slave to those things, and they become reliant on those things where it doesn't make them happier overall, but because they've lived such a lifestyle where they give into their desires, then it leads to them living a life that they might not be 100% happy with. Obviously, that's not a perfect analogy because drugs do have an addicting nature to them that biologically the other things I described just don't have. But I think my point still does stand though. Like, I think we can all relate to the way that you might feel after doom scrolling for a couple hours. Like, it doesn't feel great. I mean, maybe it does for some of y'all, but at least for me, it doesn't feel great after a while. But if I continue to live that way, if I continue to optimize ways that I believe can lead to only my pleasure, and that's the only mode of thinking that I employ throughout my life, at least to me, thinking about that has made me pull away from hedonism, because at the end of the day, if you give into your pleasures too often, it will control you. And I think it's best not to let anything control you to a large degree. It's better to have a balance, and living only for your pleasure leads to an imbalance that I believe is not healthy and doesn't lead to a fulfilling life that I used to once believe that it did.